If you try to picture the person who's taken the most lives in history, you probably imagine an evil warlord or a mad dictator. But history's biggest butcher is actually an inventor. And today we're going to discover how he destroyed the planet and put millions of lives at risk, including yours. From time to time, we all make mistakes, but only one man has screwed up so badly that he'll go down in history as one of the worst things that's ever happened to Earth. And his name is Thomas Midgley Jr. See, old Tommy was an engineer and inventor back in the early 20th century, and he created multiple substances that were so toxic that they almost destroyed humankind and the entire planet. In fact, an environmental historian named J.R. McNeil claimed that Midgley had more impact on Earth's atmosphere than any other single organism in history, which is a pretty terrible legacy to leave behind. But Midgley's story started off fairly normally. He was born in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania in 1889 and spent much of his childhood growing up in Columbus, Ohio. When Thomas was in high school, he always kept a periodic table in his pocket, so he was clearly pretty gifted academically, and he went on to graduate from the Ivy League University Cornell as a mechanical engineer in 1911. He was one smart cookie, and after a year working as a designer of cash registers, he soon became the superintendent of his father's tire manufacturing company. But he wasn't just a nepo baby, and he immediately used his big brains to start experimenting with improving the tread design of his dad's tires. In 1916, this attracted the attention of the automotive manufacturing company General Motors, who hired him to work under the company's vice president of research, Charles Kettering. GM was founded in 1908 when cars were just starting to rise and replace the horse-drawn carts of yore. By the time Thomas came along, they owned several iconic American car companies like Buick, Cadillac, and Chevrolet. But back then, cars weren't the ultra-smart vehicles that they are today, and there were no touchscreens or radios. In fact, just a few years earlier, cars didn't even have automatic ignitions, meaning that the engine needed to be hand-cranked to start. As you can imagine, having to turn a lever every time you wanted to drive was pretty tedious for the driver. And it could even be dangerous. The co-founder of Cadillac, Henry Leland, found this out firsthand when his friend Byron Carter lost his life during a hand crank-related incident in 1908. Byron was driving across the Detroit River Bridge when he noticed a lady who'd stalled on the side of the road, and like a true Jenny, pulled over and offered to help restart her car. But when he started cranking, the engine backfired, causing the heavy iron lever to jolt and smack into his face. He was hospitalized with a broken jaw, and he subsequently passed away due to complications caused by the injury. This was a pretty hard blow for Henry, especially when he found out the cantankerous car had been a Cadillac. With a guilty conscience, he vowed that the Cadillac car will kill no more men if we can help it. So GM called upon Charles Kettering to come up with a safer method for starting an automobile, and in 1912 Charlie successfully invented the first ever electrical ignition system. When the driver pressed a button, it would send power from the car's battery to an electric starter motor. This motor then turned a part called the flywheel, which essentially jump-starts the engine automatically. His design also involved spark plugs, which repeatedly create a high-voltage spark that ignites the car's mixture of fuel and air to push the engine's pistons down and keep the car running. The invention was a revelation, and the 1912 Cadillac Model 30 became the world's first car that you could start with the push of a button. By the 1920s, nearly every new car used Kettering's model, but there was a small problem with the design. And that's where our main man Midgley comes in. See, the cars using Kettering's engine systems made a continuous knocking noise as they were driven around, which was very annoying for the driver. But what was causing it? Well, gasoline contains highly reactive atoms, and in Kettering's new engine, the fuel was incredibly compressed. So the pressure would often cause the reactive fuel to spontaneously combust before the spark plugs had even fired, causing extra pops as you drove around. The knocking noise irritated drivers and damaged the engine over time, so when Midgley joined GM, Kettering tasked him with finding a solution. After conducting some research, Thomas discovered that the knocking could be stopped by adding chemical compounds to the fuel itself. These compounds are called additives, and several were tested in Midgley's experiments. One of them was aniline, a colorless, oily liquid which stopped the knocking noise just fine, but produced noxious smells as the fuel was ignited. GM didn't want to change their name to General Odor, so Midgley continued testing new substances, and in 1921 he found the answer to his prayers. He synthesized a new chemical compound called tetrathyllead, or TEL, that's made by reacting a gas called ethyl chloride with a powdered mixture of lead and sodium. Now, be warned, I'm about to get a little sciencey here. TEL was the perfect anti-knocking additive for fuel because the compound's chemical composition includes one lead atom and 4 ethyl groups, which are made up of hydrogen atoms and carbon atoms. As the extreme heat and pressure inside the engine cylinder causes TEL to decompose, the bonds between the lead atom and the ethyl groups break, forming a new compound called lead oxide. This compound stabilizes the highly reactive molecules in the gasoline, preventing them from spontaneously combusting and causing the irritating knocking noise. If, like me, you failed chemistry in high school and that all sounds like mumbo-jumbo, then let me summarize. The TEL got rid of the nasty knocking entirely. Furthermore, as it made the fuel more stable, Midgley's miracle mix could be used inside more powerful engines, allowing new cars to be faster and more efficient than ever before. The invention was widely praised, and it won Midgley the American Chemistry Society's Nichols Medal in 1922. But in reality, Tommy had made a terrible mistake because he'd officially created leaded gasoline, and inadvertently led the world into a public health disaster that would cost millions of lives. But how did his new invention cause so much damage? Well, the problem with leaded gasoline is that the combustion in the engine causes lead particles to be released into the atmosphere from the car's tailpipe, and lead is incredibly toxic. As it enters the atmosphere, it contaminates air, soil, drinking water, and crops, giving it multiple routes into the human body. Once you're exposed to lead, it can have instant effects including sneezing, vomiting, and a metallic taste in your mouth. But after repeated exposure, things get much more serious, and it can lead to a terrifying list of health complications including high blood pressure, kidney problems, joint pain, and delirium. This can further develop into life-threatening conditions like heart disease, strokes, and a wide range of different cancers. Some people are even more vulnerable than most, and if you're exposed to lead whilst pregnant, it increases the risks of miscarriage, premature birth, and causes damage to your baby's brain and nervous system. Yikes, that's pretty frightening stuff. But surely no one, not even Midgley, could have known that this invention could cause so much harm, right? Well, incredibly, Thomas and the rest of GM did learn about the dangers of TEL very early on, when the workers who produced the chemical started showing signs of severe lead poisoning. In October 1924, one TEL manufacturing plant in New Jersey recorded that 40 of their 49 employees were suffering from symptoms like seizures, hallucinations, and insanity. Eventually, 5 of the workers passed away due to their exposure to TEL, and production was halted for over 9 months. But GM and Midgley ultimately kept turning a blind eye because of all the sweet money they were making. Leaded gasoline's incredible engine performance made it very valuable, and in 1923, Midgley even said to Kettering, "Can you imagine how much money we're going to make with this? We're going to make $200 million, maybe even more." That's equivalent to $3 billion when adjusted for inflation, so for Midgley and GM, the product was just too valuable to give up. TEL gasoline officially went on the market in February 1923 at a gas station in Dayton, Ohio. But unsurprisingly, it was a hit, and by the summer of 1925, 1.1 billion liters of leaded gas had been sold worldwide. It turned out Midgley was as good a businessman as he was an inventor, because he became the first manager of GM's newest enterprise, the Ethyl Corporation. This company produced and marketed leaded gasoline, and they used a clever trick to promote their product without drawing attention to its lead content. They almost exclusively referred to the tetrethyllead as ethyl fluid, so lots of articles about the new miracle product made no mention of its lead content at all. Ethyl Corp even released their own full-page advertisements where they answered FAQs from their customers, and again, they didn't mention lead once in a clear attempt to hide the product's toxicity. Still, some physicians did try to make the public aware of the fuel's lead content and warn them about the dangers of using it in their cars. In New York, TEL was even banned for 3 years soon after its release due to the disaster in New Jersey. But Midgley knew that they could counter all this backlash by generating as much positive press as possible, and he started trying to convince the public that TEL was non-toxic by conducting live experiments on himself. At a press conference, Midgley poured pure TEL over his hands and inhaled its vapor for 60 seconds through his nose before saying, "I could do this every day without getting any health problems whatsoever." Thomas was lying through his teeth, but the journalists ate it up, and Ethyl Corp gained a ton of good publicity. Still, Midgley did receive some karma for his trick because he ended up with severe lead poisoning that took over a year to cure. But his gambit ultimately worked, and although eventually everyone knew that ethyl gasoline contained lead, the public had been tricked into believing it was totally safe. Ethyl became the most popular fuel in the world throughout the 20th century, and gas companies even released premium variants which contained even more lead. This all meant that between 1926 and 1985, 7 million tons of lead were released into the atmosphere in the US alone. As people all over the world started absorbing these toxic emissions on a daily basis, the impact on public health was devastating. In 2018, a retrospective study found that in the USA, lead exposure has contributed to over 250,000 deaths from heart disease every year since ethyl fuel was introduced. That adds up to roughly 25 million deaths over the past century. Nobody knows for sure what that figure is globally, but some experts estimate that TEL has contributed to at least 100 million fatalities worldwide from heart disease, strokes, and cancer. For context, the infamous Mongolian warlord Genghis Khan is said to have taken around 40 million lives during his reign in the 12th and 13th centuries, so Tommy puts his numbers to shame. Furthermore, studies have shown that some of the most damaging effects of lead poisoning occur in children, as it causes growth delays and higher chances of developing learning difficulties. In fact, experts believe that lead is so damaging to kids that it's literally made entire generations less intelligent. See, the amount of lead in your blood is often measured in micrograms per deciliter, which is 1/millionth of a gram present in 1/10 of a liter. In 2017, a study in New Zealand found that for each 5 micrograms per deciliter increase of lead in a child's blood, they lose around 1.5 IQ points as they grow up. In 2022, researchers from Duke University, North Carolina, crunched these numbers and estimated that since 1923, leaded gasoline has resulted in a combined loss of 824 million IQ points from over 170 million Americans who are still alive today. That averages out at 4.8 IQ points per person, lost by half the country's population. So if you were born during the era of leaded gasoline, you were probably highly exposed to lead as a child, and you're literally less intelligent than you should be. That explains why I'm a Gram's such a dum-dum. But it's not just your intelligence that can suffer, and we've also discovered that higher lead exposure can increase aggression and impulsivity, which creates a pretty rough cocktail of bad behavior. In fact, several countries have found that as lead emissions rose from the 1940s to the 70s, their crime rate increased at the exact same pace around 20 years later, from the 60s to the 90s. This correlation was confusing until researchers realized that it showed that the toddlers who were exposed to lead as kids were statistically more likely to become criminals when they grew up. So in summary, Midgley's invention caused cancer, dumbed down kids, and led to increased violence on the streets, creating unimaginable amounts of death and destruction all around the world. But thankfully, this was all exposed in 1969 when researchers finally conducted a study that definitively proved that TEL emissions have toxic effects on humans. The U.S. government reacted quickly, and in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded. They introduced the Clean Air Act, which aimed to reduce pollution in lots of different ways, including measures against ethyl fuel. Soon, they'd established regulations for the amount of lead that's allowed in gasoline and introduced strategies to reduce the other toxic emissions that are produced by cars. Ethyl Corp fought this with a pretty shameless media campaign, and they even challenged the EPA in federal court, which is incredibly shady. But fortunately, they lost and the regulations came into effect. Still, the automobile industry didn't phase out leaded gasoline immediately, and instead they started fitting cars with catalytic converters. This is a device in a car's exhaust that converts its harmful emissions of carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, and hydrocarbons into safer emissions like carbon dioxide and water. This satisfied the EPA, and lead continued to be emitted from cars until it was discovered that leaded gasoline damaged catalytic converters too. Is there anything that stuff doesn't kill? This was a deal breaker for the EPA, so in 1973 they specifically called for leaded gas to be gradually phased out, stating that by 1986 any leaded gas had to have just 1/10 of a gram of lead per gallon. As TEL became less valuable, fuel companies started developing other less harmful chemicals as anti-knocking agents, and this slowly led to the complete elimination of leaded gas in America. On January 1st, 1996, it was banned from the States entirely, and the European Union followed suit in 2000. Ethyl Corp responded by moving their focus to selling TEL to developing countries and poisoning their populations instead. But in 2002, the United Nations Environment Program launched an initiative that slowly eliminated the use of leaded gasoline in cars around the entire world. Over the next couple of decades, Midgley's invention was phased out around the planet, and in 2021, Algeria became the last country to prohibit leaded gas, ending Midgley's reign of terror once and for all. Unsurprisingly, once the bans came into effect and toxic lead stopped being pumped into the air, the positive impacts were pretty clear to see. Criminal activity in the U.S. peaked in the early 90s with around 14.8 million offenses committed across the country, but since leaded gas started to get phased out in the mid-70s, the crime rate drastically reduced in the mid-90s as the kids who had faced less lead exposure grew up into peaceful, unpoisoned adults. New York recorded its sharpest drop in criminal offenses since the Prohibition ended in 1933, going from around 200,000 violent crimes in 1993 to 132,000 in 1996 and 107,000 by 1999. They saw the rates of assault drop by 27%, robbery by 42%, and homicide by 49%, which is pretty incredible. But it wasn't just the Big Apple enjoying less criminal activity. In Washington, D.C., violent crime dropped 58%, in Dallas it fell by 70%, and in Los Angeles, rates plummet a whopping 78% compared to the lawless and lead-filled era of the early 90s. Forget Al Capone, Midgley might have caused more crime than anyone in history. The same positive trend can be seen with the gain of IQ points and significant improvements to the public's health. In April 2011, the United Nations estimated that phasing out leaded fuels has already prevented 1.2 million premature deaths from lead poisoning, a loss of 322 million IQ points, and close to 60 million crime cases worldwide. It also saved the global economy money due to a drop in healthcare expenses, and the UN think that the world has saved $2.4 trillion a year since the bans, which is around 4% of the planet's GDP. So it's fair to say that Midgley's work had a pretty huge impact on the planet. The lives, IQ points, and trillions of dollars that his invention stole is definitely enough to tarnish his legacy as an inventor. But unbelievably, Thomas didn't just give us the gift of leaded gasoline. He also invented another substance that's caused just as much damage by poisoning the Earth itself and putting humanity at risk for a second time. Midgley's second insidious invention started out ironically as an attempt to improve public health by replacing a dangerous chemical with something safer. See, in the late 1920s, compounds like ammonia, methyl chloride, and sulfur dioxide were being used as refrigerants, which is a chemical in fridges and AC units that keep things nice and cool. Inside a fridge, the refrigerant starts out as a cold liquid with an incredibly low boiling point. As it flows through metal pipes called coils, it absorbs heat from the air inside the refrigerator to keep the food cold. This heats the liquid up and turns it into a gas, which is then pushed through condenser coils, which release the heat out the back of the fridge. This cools the refrigerant down again until it turns back into a liquid, which is transported back into the coils to repeat the cycle. This system works perfectly, but the chemicals used in the 20s were either toxic, flammable, or explosive. So if there was a slight leak, it could poison the homeowner or in extreme cases blow them up. Nobody wants to explode while searching their fridge for leftovers. So in the 1920s, our old friend Charles Kettering told Thomas to work with GM's subsidiary, the Frigidaire Appliance Company, and develop a new, safer refrigerant. They spent years on the project until 1928 when Thomas and his team formed a reaction between a liquid called carbon tetrachloride and a gas called hydrogen fluoride. This produced an entirely new substance called dichlorodifluoromethane, or Freon for short. The substance had the ability to rapidly change from a liquid to a gas while absorbing heat, making it a useful refrigerant. And more importantly, it was totally non-flammable and had much lower toxicity levels than existing refrigerants on the market. Midgley knew he was on to another winner, and in 1930, GM and the chemical company DuPont joined forces to form a new venture called the Kinetic Chemical Company to mass manufacture Freon and sell it as a refrigerant.
Freon refrigerants are ideal. Quick cooling, safe, non-flammable.
Just like leaded gasoline, Midgley used some of his signature showmanship to promote the product. At a meeting of the American Chemical Society in 1930, he inhaled a lungful of Freon before using it to blow out a birthday candle, proving it was both non-toxic and non-flammable. The product was a hit, and by 1935, 8 million new Freon refrigerators had been sold in the U.S. Midgley was once again awarded for his scientific efforts, and he received the Perkin Medal from the Society of Chemical Industry in 1937 for his work. But as you know, Thomas's inventions have a habit of having unexpected, deadly side effects, and the problems with Freon arose because Midgley had inadvertently created the first commercially successful chlorofluorocarbon, or CFC. This is a group of chemicals that are created by taking hydrocarbons, compounds made up entirely of carbon and hydrogen atoms, and replacing the hydrogen atoms with chlorine and fluorine atoms. Hydrogen atoms are incredibly flammable and reactive. In contrast, chlorine and fluorine form strong, stable bonds with carbon, which makes CFC molecules non-flammable and incredibly non-reactive. This made Freon safer to use as a refrigerant, and after seeing the Kinetic Chemical Company's success, other companies started using it in their products too. As a non-toxic, non-flammable, and non-reactive substance, Freon was particularly useful as a propellant in aerosols, and before long, deodorants, hairsprays, and cleaning supplies were all filled with Midgley's gas. Freon was becoming very popular, and by the 1950s it was used in refrigerators in over 90% of urban American homes. Furthermore, cities across the U.S. introduced public health codes stating that AC units in public buildings had to use CFC refrigerants due to their non-toxicity. CFC use grew, and by the 1960s over 1 million metric tons of it were being produced annually in the U.S., garnering over $1 billion a year. Once again, Thomas's big brains had created a multi-billion-dollar industry, and he was reaping the rewards. In the 40s, he was given lots of medals for his research, and in 1944, he was even elected the president and chairman of the American Chemical Society. So where did it all go wrong? Well, in 1974, two scientists called Mario Molina and Frank Rowland wanted to answer a basic question. What is the consequence of society releasing something into the environment that wasn't there before? They decided to focus their investigation on Freon, and they found out that since Midgley's first synthesized the miracle substance in the 1920s, it had been slowly destroying the planet. See, when aerosols that contained CFC were sprayed and Freon appliances were destroyed, their CFC molecules would be released into the air and wind up accumulating in the stratosphere, which is the second layer of Earth's atmosphere. Here, the molecules would have dire effects on the ozone layer, which is like our planet's very own shield, sitting 9 to 18 miles above the surface. This layer of ozone molecules absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation and prevents it from reaching the Earth's surface. But as the CFC molecules gathered in the stratosphere, the UV radiation hitting them was strong enough to actually break the bond between their chlorine and carbon atoms, which released pure chlorine. Unfortunately, chlorine atoms are highly reactive with ozone molecules and cause them to completely break apart. In fact, one single atom of chlorine can rapidly destroy more than 100,000 ozone molecules, which makes the ozone layer grow thinner and thinner. This allows large amounts of UV radiation to reach the Earth, and as you can imagine, standing under that big nuclear reactor in the sky without any protection is pretty dangerous. We're all regularly exposed to enough UV to give us a nice summer tan, or in my case, some sunburn. However, too much exposure can severely damage the DNA in your skin, which greatly increases your chances of developing skin cancer and serious eye conditions like cataracts. This means that damaging the ozone layer can have serious effects on public health, so Molina and Rowland made their findings public and warned heavily against the use of CFCs in any capacity. Of course, Freon's manufacturers were quick to dismiss their research, but in 1976 the National Academy of Sciences published the scientists' findings, and in 1979 the U.S. government banned the use of CFCs in aerosols. This prompted further research into the impact of Freon, and it soon became clear that the situation was much worse than previously thought. In 1985, the British Antarctic Survey found that there was already a gigantic hole in the ozone layer above Antarctica due to a buildup of CFCs. Furthermore, other researchers discovered that Freon also causes significant environmental damage to the Earth's surface by functioning as a dangerous greenhouse gas. This is because it retains a large amount of heat, so when it accumulates in the stratosphere, it gradually increases the temperature of the entire planet. So much for being a refrigerant. This global warming directly results in lots of natural disasters, including forest fires, rising sea levels, and stronger, more frequent droughts. There are other greenhouse gases out there like carbon dioxide, but Freon is precisely 10,900 times more effective at trapping heat than CO2 over the course of 100 years, making it an incredibly significant contributor to global warming. In fact, the surface temperature of the Earth has increased by an entire 1.8 degrees since 1900, largely due to greenhouse gases like CFCs. As all this data came out, the world was pretty horrified, so everyone decided to put aside their differences and join forces to save the environment. No, seriously. In 1987, all 197 countries in the UN signed an international treaty called the Montreal Protocol, which was dedicated to phasing out ozone-depleting substances like Freon. The treaty targeted climate change in lots of ways, but one of its actions meant that in 1994, all companies in the U.S., including Frigidaire, had to stop using CFCs for good. By 2010, the worldwide production of CFCs was completely banned, which drastically reduced the destruction of the ozone layer and global warming. The whole planet joined the effort, and the Montreal Protocol is widely believed to be the most successful international environmental agreement of all time. Furthermore, in 1995, Rowland and Molina won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their findings. They shared it with a meteorologist called Paul Crutzen, who'd conducted further research into CFCs based on the dynamic duo's initial research. The way the whole world worked together is pretty heartwarming, and the only people who weren't happy were the companies that manufactured Freon. But they had to suck it up and find alternatives that were better for the environment. They developed new substances for refrigeration and largely switched to naturally occurring hydrocarbons like propane and butane to act as propellants. Some of these alternatives weren't quite as effective as Freon, and those hydrocarbons are flammable, but the impact on the ozone layer was definitely worth the downgrade. In the year 2000, the hull above Antarctica had reached a record size of 11 million square miles due to lingering CFCs. But since the bans came into effect, the ozone layer has been able to slowly create new ozone molecules and repair itself. In 2019, the Antarctic ozone hole was recorded to be shrinking for the first time, and it was even smaller than it was when it was first discovered. In fact, the ozone layer is healing so rapidly that some scientists predict that it could recover completely by 2066. So it looks like the planet will heal from Midgley's invention, but it was a close call. In 2009, a study explored what would have happened in an alternate reality where CFCs were never banned, and surprise, life on the darkest timeline isn't good. As you can see, by the mid-2060s, the ozone layer would have pretty much disappeared completely. This would have made going outside for short periods of time incredibly dangerous due to the amount of UV hitting Earth's surface. In fact, just crossing the street could cost you your life. See, while there are currently around 58,000 deaths from skin cancer every year, a study in 2011 showed that the figure would have been 16 to 30% higher if CFCs weren't banned. In fact, in 2015, the EPA estimated that the treaty has prevented 280 million cases of skin cancer and 1.5 million cancer deaths in the US alone. As for global warming, the UN has stated that reducing the use of ozone-depleting substances has prevented a further 0.9 to 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit temperature rise since the Montreal Protocol was signed, which has saved countless lives by fending off environmental disasters. Of course, this isn't really a happy ending because Midgley's creation of leaded gasoline and Freon was still responsible for millions of deaths and a whole lot of environmental damage. But plot twist, he wasn't around to see any of this because one of his final inventions caused tragedy on a much smaller scale by taking the inventor's life all the way back in the 1940s. See, in 1940, Thomas contracted polio, a virus that affects your spinal cord and leaves you partially paralyzed. Midgley couldn't use his legs, so he decided to put on his inventing hat again by devising a system of strings and pulleys that would help him lift himself out of bed. However, one day he became entangled in the ropes and couldn't work himself free, so on November 2, 1944, Thomas Midgley Jr. died of strangulation at the age of 55. This meant that Thomas didn't get to see the extent of the damage caused by leaded gasoline and Freon, and when he died, he was still a hero in the eyes of the scientific community. But like so many others, Midgley was ultimately destroyed by one of his inventions, and I'd like to say he truly earned his legacy as the most deadly inventor of all time. I hate to say it was a fitting ending, but it kinda feels like poetic justice, no? The world definitely would have been a better place without Midgley's interfering inventions. But which part of his story did you find the craziest? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.